Your mind has been running your life without your permission for decades. And the worst part? You didn't even know it was happening. Think about that for a second. Every financial decision you've ever made, every opportunity you moved toward, and every one you quietly walked away from. Every moment you almost tried something and then didn't. Every ceiling you hit and accepted as the natural limit of what was available to you. None of that was random. None of it was bad luck. It was your mind, executing a program you never consciously chose, with a precision that would be impressive if it weren't costing you so much. Napoleon Hill spent 20 years trying to understand why some people seem to bend reality toward what they want, while others, working just as hard, wanting just as badly, stay locked in the same patterns their entire lives. What he found wasn't about talent. It wasn't about resources or timing or who you know. It was about who's actually in control of the mind doing the wanting. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that means. And more importantly, you'll understand what it actually takes to change it. Here's something Hill documented that most people spend their entire lives never fully confronting. The mind you think you're using to make decisions isn't actually the mind making most of your decisions. This isn't a metaphor. It isn't a philosophical abstraction. It's a description of how your brain actually functions, observed by Hill through decades of interviews with the most successful men of his era and confirmed by everything neuroscience has documented in the centuries since. Here's what's actually happening. Every thought you consciously think, every intention you deliberately form, every goal you set with genuine motivation and real desire behind it, all of that is occurring at what Hill called the conscious level of mind, the surface layer, the part you have direct access to, the part you experience as you, when you're making a decision or forming a plan or telling yourself that this time things are going to be different. That conscious level is real. It matters, but it's not where the actual governing of your behavior happens. Beneath it, always running, never sleeping, never taking a day off, is what Hill called the subconscious mind. And the relationship between these two levels of mind is the most important thing you could possibly understand about why your life looks the way it does right now. Think of it this way. The conscious mind is the architect. It designs the building. It draws the plans. It decides what it wants the structure to look like, how many floors, what materials, what the finished result should be. The subconscious mind is the construction crew. And here's the problem most people never see clearly enough to address. The construction crew doesn't build what the architect currently wants. It builds what it has always built. What it was trained to build years ago by experiences and environments and absorbed beliefs that the current version of you would never consciously choose. It follows the old blueprints, not because it's broken, not because it's working against you, but because those are the only instructions it ever received that carried enough emotional weight to be treated as permanent directives. So you have an architect, your conscious mind, drawing plans for wealth, for freedom, for a life that looks genuinely different from the one you currently have. And you have a construction crew, your subconscious, quietly, efficiently, tirelessly building the same structure it has always built, regardless of what the new plans say. This is why effort alone doesn't produce the results most people expect it to produce. This is why someone can want something genuinely, work toward it sincerely, and still find themselves, year after year, arriving at something that looks remarkably similar to where they started. Not because they didn't try hard enough, because the trying was happening at the surface level, while the actual governing of behavior was happening somewhere else entirely, in a layer of mind that the trying, by itself, simply doesn't reach. Hill understood this earlier than almost anyone writing about success in his era, and it shaped everything about how he thought about the difference between people who actually changed their circumstances and people who spent their lives intending to. The people who changed things didn't just want differently. They learned to communicate with the part of their mind that actually runs the show, not through force, not through willpower applied harder and longer than everyone else, through something more specific, more precise, and considerably more interesting than either of those things. Something Hill found in every single man he studied who had built something extraordinary from genuinely ordinary beginnings. A specific understanding of how the deeper mind actually receives instruction and what kind of communication it's actually capable of responding to. Because here's what most people never discover. The subconscious mind doesn't respond to the same language the conscious mind speaks. You can't reason with it. You can't argue it into new behavior. You can't motivate it with logic or inspire it with a good enough plan. It responds to something else entirely. Something Hill identified with unusual precision. Something that explains why some people seem to change almost effortlessly while others apply enormous conscious effort and barely move the needle at all. Hill spent years trying to identify exactly what made the difference. He had already established that the subconscious mind was where actual behavior was governed. He had already observed that conscious effort alone, willpower, discipline, deliberate intention, consistently failed to produce lasting change in the men who relied on it exclusively. He had watched intelligent, motivated, genuinely ambitious people apply enormous conscious effort toward changing their financial circumstances and arrive, years later, essentially where they started. And he had watched other men, sometimes with less apparent talent, sometimes with worse starting circumstances, produce results that seemed almost disproportionate to the effort visibly invested. The difference wasn't in what they wanted. Both groups wanted similar things, with similar intensity. The difference was in how the wanting was communicated to the deeper mind. Hill eventually identified what he called the language of the subconscious. And the first thing worth understanding about this language is that it has almost nothing in common with how the conscious mind communicates. The conscious mind speaks in words, in logic, in plans and strategies, and carefully reasoned arguments about why a particular outcome makes sense and deserves to be pursued. The subconscious mind doesn't speak that language at all. It speaks in feeling, specifically in emotionally charged images, vivid, felt, sensory representations of reality that carry enough emotional weight to be registered by the deeper mind as something worth encoding, something worth treating as a directive rather than simply another piece of passing information to be processed and forgotten. Hill was precise about this distinction in a way that most retellings of his work fail to capture accurately. He wasn't saying that feeling good about your goals was helpful in some general motivational sense. He was saying something far more specific and far more mechanical than that. He was saying that the subconscious mind has a specific threshold of emotional intensity that determines whether incoming information gets encoded as a directive, something it will actually work to bring about, or simply processed as neutral data and discarded. Below that threshold, no amount of repetition produces change. You can repeat an affirmation 10,000 times without feeling it, and the deeper mind will treat it exactly the way it treats the background noise of a television left on in another room. Present, registered in some minimal technical sense, completely without influence on actual behavior. Above that threshold, even a single exposure can produce lasting change. Because what crosses that threshold isn't just information. It's instruction. It's the kind of input the subconscious mind was designed, at the deepest level of its function, to receive and act upon. Hill documented this threshold in every man he studied who had successfully reprogrammed their own deeper mind. Without exception, the turning point in their transformation wasn't the moment they understood something intellectually. It was the moment they felt something so completely, so vividly, so specifically, so deeply, that it crossed whatever internal threshold existed between information and instruction. This is why the same idea can reach two different people and produce completely different results. One person hears it, understands it intellectually, files it away alongside 100 other things they've understood intellectually and never fully applied. Another person hears the same idea and something in them lights up. Not with excitement exactly, but with a kind of recognition so complete that it bypasses the analytical layer entirely and lands somewhere deeper, where it immediately starts reorganizing the way that person's mind operates. The difference between those two experiences isn't intelligence. It isn't even openness, exactly. It's the degree to which the idea connects to something emotionally real, something that matters enough, at a felt level rather than a conceptual one, to generate the kind of emotional charge the subconscious mind actually responds to. This explains something that confuses most people who have read Hill's work and tried to apply it without producing the results they expected. They understood the principles. They just never felt them. And the subconscious mind, with complete indifference to how much you understand something at the surface level, responds only to what you actually feel at the level where real belief lives. Hill found that once people understood this distinction clearly, once they stopped trying to think their way into new behavior and started learning to feel their way there, something fundamental changed in how they approached the entire project of changing their own minds. But understanding that feeling is the language doesn't automatically tell you how to generate the right kind of feeling on demand, especially when your current circumstances are actively producing feelings that point in the opposite direction. That gap between knowing feeling matters and actually being able to generate the specific feelings that produce change is where most people get stuck. And what Hill found about how to actually close that gap was something nobody expected. Hill was honest about the difficulty of this, in a way that most people who simplify his work never acknowledge. Telling someone to feel differently about their financial circumstances, while those circumstances are actively producing the opposite feeling, is a little like telling someone to feel warm while standing in the middle of a blizzard. The instruction makes sense in principle. The application is considerably more demanding than the instruction suggests. Most people who encounter the idea that feeling is the language of the subconscious mind try to generate the right feeling through force, through willpower applied to emotion rather than to behavior. They try to manufacture enthusiasm or confidence or the felt sense of abundance through sheer determination, and then wonder why it feels hollow, why the deeper mind doesn't seem to be responding, why the practice produces a vague sense of going through the motions rather than the genuine internal shift they're trying to create. Hill found something specific about why forced feeling doesn't work, and it goes back to the gatekeeper we discussed earlier. The analytical conscious mind, the one that evaluates everything for consistency with existing belief, doesn't just filter external information. It also evaluates internally generated feeling and manufactured emotion. Feeling you're trying to force rather than genuinely experiencing gets recognized and filtered out almost immediately because it doesn't carry the specific quality of authenticity that allows it to pass through to the deeper level where actual encoding happens. You can't fake your way past your own subconscious. It knows the difference between a feeling you're performing and a feeling you're actually having, and it responds only to the latter. So the question becomes, how do you generate genuine feeling about a reality that doesn't yet exist in your external life, without manufacturing it artificially, and without waiting for external circumstances to change first before you allow yourself to feel differently? Hill's answer was, in some ways, the most counterintuitive thing in his entire body of work. He said you don't generate the feeling directly. You generate the conditions in which the feeling arises naturally. Here's what he meant by that, and why it matters so much for actually applying this principle rather than simply understanding it intellectually. The subconscious mind doesn't distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and an actually lived one, not in the way that matters for encoding. What it responds to is the felt quality of the experience, not the factual status of whether it occurred in external reality. This isn't mysticism. It's a description of how the brain actually processes vivid mental imagery, confirmed by everything modern neuroscience has documented about the relationship between imagination and neural encoding. When you imagine something with sufficient vividness and sufficient emotional engagement, The deeper mind processes it with many of the same mechanisms it uses to process actual experience. The encoding is real. The instruction is genuine. The directive that gets sent to the subconscious is functionally similar to what would be sent if the experience had actually occurred in the external world. Hill found that the men who most successfully reprogrammed their deeper minds had developed a specific practice around this. Not visualization in the casual, cursory sense that word usually implies. A few seconds of vague mental imagery before moving on to something else. Something far more deliberate, far more sensory, far more emotionally engaged than that. They would construct, in their minds, a scene. Specific, detailed, multisensory. A particular moment in the life they were building. Not a general impression of wealth or success, but a specific instant, concrete enough to inhabit rather than simply observe. They would place themselves inside that scene completely, feeling the specific physical sensations of being there. The texture of the chair, the quality of light in the room, the specific emotional tone of a person who had genuinely arrived at the life being imagined, rather than someone still hoping to arrive someday. And they would hold that scene, with full sensory and emotional engagement, long enough for the feeling to arise naturally from the vividness of the imagined experience itself, rather than trying to force the feeling first and then attach it to the image. The feeling, generated this way, wasn't manufactured. It was real, arising genuinely from a genuinely experienced mental state, even though the external circumstances that would normally produce it hadn't yet materialized. And that genuine feeling, carried into the deeper mind by the vividness of the imagined experience, was received exactly the way the subconscious mind receives instruction from actual lived experience. As real, as directive, as something worth building toward. I want you to pause here for a moment. If what I'm describing is landing somewhere genuine in you, if some part of you recognizes, perhaps for the first time, why previous attempts to change your own mind may have fallen short, I want you to write the words "I am ready" in the comments right now. Not as a ritual, as a genuine declaration, made in this specific moment, that you're willing to go deeper than surface-level understanding and actually apply what it takes to make your mind obey. The people who write that today are declaring something real about who they're choosing to become. And that declaration, made publicly, with genuine feeling behind it, is itself the first practice of everything we've been discussing. Write it, and let's keep going. Because understanding how to generate genuine feeling is essential. But Hill found that there's a specific obstacle that derails almost everyone who tries this practice. Something that has nothing to do with technique and everything to do with a quality of mind most people have never deliberately developed. Hill watched it happen across enough interviews that he eventually stopped being surprised by it. Someone would encounter the principle. They'd understand it genuinely, not just the surface version, but the actual mechanism. They'd begin the practice with real intention, real effort, real desire to change something fundamental about how their mind operated. And then, within days or weeks, something would derail them. Not external circumstances, not lack of time or access or resources. Something internal. Something that arrived almost immediately once the practice began, and that most people, having never been warned about it, interpreted as evidence that the practice wasn't working, rather than as the most reliable sign that it was. Hill called it resistance of the established order. What he was describing, in his own language, decades before modern psychology developed more precise vocabulary for it, was the mind's built-in mechanism for protecting existing belief structures from being too easily overwritten. Here's how it works, and why understanding it is essential for anyone serious about actually making their mind obey rather than simply learning about the possibility. When you begin introducing genuinely new imagery and feeling into your subconscious practice, when you start generating, with real emotional engagement, the felt experience of a reality significantly different from your current one, something in the deeper mind recognizes the incoming material as a challenge to what's already stored there. The existing belief structures, installed over years or decades of accumulated experience, don't simply make room for the new material. They push back, not passively, actively. What this looks like in practice is a sudden intensification of the exact thoughts and feelings the practice is designed to replace. You sit down to hold a vivid, emotionally engaged image of financial abundance, and your mind, almost immediately, floods with specific, detailed, emotionally charged reminders of your current financial reality. The specific number in the bank account, the specific bill that arrived this week, the specific conversation about money that left you feeling exactly the way you're trying to stop feeling. This counterattack from the established belief structure feels, from the inside, like the practice failing, like the mind refusing to cooperate, like evidence that the gap between where you are and where you're trying to go is simply too large to bridge through internal work alone. It isn't any of those things. Hill found, with remarkable consistency, that this intensification of resistance was almost always a sign that the practice was working, that the new material was landing with enough force in the deeper mind to actually threaten the existing structure, rather than simply passing through without registering. The existing structure only fights what actually threatens it. If the practice weren't reaching the level where real belief is stored, the resistance wouldn't arise. The mind would simply process the imagery as neutral information, no threat, no pushback, nothing to defend against. The fact that resistance shows up, often intensely, often disconcertingly, is evidence of genuine contact between the new material and the existing structure. Evidence that something real is happening beneath the surface, even when nothing visible has yet changed. Understanding this doesn't make the resistance comfortable. Hill was clear about that. The intensification of old fear and old scarcity-based thinking, arriving precisely when you're trying to replace it with something different, is genuinely unpleasant. It can feel destabilizing in a way that has nothing to do with external circumstances, a kind of internal turbulence that seems to come from nowhere and serves no obvious purpose. But it does serve a purpose, a specific, important one. It reveals, with unusual precision, exactly which beliefs are most deeply encoded in your deeper mind. The ones that push back hardest are the ones with the most accumulated emotional weight behind them, which means they're also the ones that, once actually replaced, will produce the most significant change in your automatic behavior. The resistance is a map, not a stop sign. And the men Hill studied who made it through this period, who stayed with the practice despite the intensification rather than interpreting it as failure, almost universally described what came after as a kind of clearing. A period where the resistance, having exhausted itself against consistent new input, gradually quieted, where the practice started feeling less like fighting and more like settling into something that was starting, finally, to feel real. But there's a specific quality Hill found in the men who successfully navigated this resistance, something that had nothing to do with the practice itself and everything to do with a decision made before the practice even began. A decision most people never consciously make, which is exactly why most people never successfully make it through the resistance to what's waiting on the other side. Hill found it buried in the stories of every man who had successfully crossed from one financial reality into a genuinely different one. Not in the strategies they used, not in the specific practices or the particular principles they applied. Underneath all of that, prior to all of that, there was always a decision that had been made, sometimes consciously, sometimes without fully realizing its significance in the moment it happened, that determined whether everything else would actually work. Hill called it the decision of total commitment. And I want to be careful with that phrase, because it sounds like something you've heard before. Something that belongs in the category of motivational instruction: commit fully, go all in, burn the boats. Language so common in certain circles that it has lost almost all of its actual meaning through overuse. What Hill was describing was something more specific than any of those phrases capture. Total commitment, in Hill's framework, wasn't about the intensity of effort applied to external action. It was about a specific internal decision, a decision about which version of your own story you were going to treat as the authoritative one. Here's what he meant by that. Every person carries, simultaneously, two competing narratives about who they are and what's possible for their life. The first narrative is built from accumulated experience, from everything that has actually happened so far, the failures, the setbacks, the specific ways reality has pushed back against previous attempts to move beyond current circumstances. This narrative has enormous evidential weight behind it. It's grounded in real events, real outcomes, real patterns that have repeated across enough time to feel not like a story, but like objective fact. The second narrative is built from desire and possibility, from the felt sense of a different version of life, one that hasn't yet materialized in external reality, that has no accumulated evidence behind it, that exists, for now, only as an image held in the mind and a feeling generated in quiet moments of genuine internal engagement. Most people live their entire lives treating the first narrative as the real one and the second as a wish, a hope, something they'd like to be true that probably isn't, for someone in their specific circumstances, with their specific history, carrying their specific accumulated weight of things that didn't work out the way they wanted. The decision Hill identified wasn't a decision to pretend the first narrative didn't exist. The failures were real. The setbacks were real. The patterns were real. It was a decision about which narrative got to determine the direction of the next decision. Not the next year, not the next chapter, the next decision, the one immediately available. The men who successfully reprogrammed their deeper minds had made, at some specific point, sometimes dramatically, sometimes quietly, rarely with the clarity of a movie moment, a decision to stop letting the accumulated evidence of the past determine the available options of the present. Not by denying the past, by refusing to grant it the specific authority of determining what was still possible from this moment forward. This sounds philosophical. The practical application is anything but. In practice, it means that when the resistance arises, when the practice of directed mental imagery triggers the counterattack of established belief, flooding the mind with specific, emotionally charged reminders of current limitation, the decision of total commitment is what determines the response. Without that prior decision firmly in place, the response to resistance is almost always the same. The new narrative retreats. The old one reasserts its authority. The practice gets quietly abandoned, not through a dramatic decision to quit, but through the gradual accumulation of moments where the old evidence felt more real than the new possibility. With that decision in place, the response is different. Not easier, necessarily. The resistance is equally intense either way, but the prior decision changes what the resistance means. Instead of evidence that the new narrative isn't real enough to hold against the weight of accumulated experience, it becomes simply what resistance feels like. The expected, predicted, already understood response of an established belief structure encountering a genuine challenge. Expected, not alarming. Uncomfortable, not decisive. Hill watched this distinction determine the outcome of more attempts at genuine transformation than almost any other single factor. Not the quality of the practice, not the depth of the desire, not the intelligence or the discipline or the consistency of effort. The prior decision about which story got to speak with final authority in the moments when both were present simultaneously. And here's what Hill found about where that decision actually gets made. Something about the specific conditions that make it possible, and why most people are waiting for those conditions to arrive rather than understanding that the conditions are created by the decision itself, not the other way around. Most people are waiting for the right moment to make the decision of total commitment. They're waiting for enough evidence that the new narrative is viable before they're willing to treat it as the authoritative one. waiting for enough external confirmation, a sign, a result, a shift in circumstances significant enough to justify committing fully to a direction that currently has almost no evidence behind it. This waiting feels reasonable. It feels like prudence, like the mature, responsible approach of someone who has been disappointed before and learned not to invest completely in things that haven't yet proven themselves. Hill found it was the single most consistent reason people never actually made the decision at all, because the evidence they were waiting for could only be produced by the decision itself. This is the specific circularity that keeps most people permanently in place, and it's worth understanding precisely because it's so easy to miss while you're inside it. The new narrative, the one about a different version of your financial life, about what you're actually capable of, about what's genuinely available to someone who has made the internal changes we've been discussing. That narrative cannot produce external evidence until it has been treated as authoritative long enough to actually start governing behavior. And it can't start governing behavior until the decision has been made to treat it as authoritative. And the decision to treat it as authoritative feels unjustified until there's external evidence for it. Around and around, indefinitely, until something breaks the loop. Hill found that the something was always the same thing in every man he studied who had successfully made the decision and crossed into genuinely different territory. A moment of recognizing the circularity itself, not abstractly, personally. A specific moment where someone saw, with unusual clarity, that the evidence they were waiting for and the decision they were waiting to make were the same thing, that one could not precede the other, and that therefore waiting for the evidence was simply a sophisticated way of ensuring it would never arrive. That recognition, Hill found, was what actually made the decision possible, because it removed the illusion that the decision was premature. That waiting for more evidence was a reasonable strategy rather than a guarantee of permanent stasis. Once someone saw clearly that the evidence and the decision were the same thing, that committing to the new narrative was itself the first piece of evidence that the new narrative was real, the waiting stopped feeling like wisdom and started feeling like what it actually was. A way of staying safe that had been mistaken for a way of staying smart. And the decision, once the circularity was genuinely seen, became not easier exactly, but differently difficult. Not the impossible difficulty of leaping without any ground visible below, but the manageable difficulty of taking a step you understand clearly, even if what comes after that step remains uncertain. This brings us to something Hill considered essential that most people never think to examine in relation to this decision: the environment in which the decision gets made. Not the external environment, the financial circumstances, the social context, the practical situation someone finds themselves in. The internal environment, the specific quality of mental state present at the moment when the decision is either made or deferred. Hill found that decisions of this magnitude, decisions that require treating an unproven narrative as more authoritative than a heavily evidenced one, are almost never successfully made during periods of acute stress or acute discouragement. Not because the person isn't capable of making them, but because the internal environment during those periods is dominated entirely by the established narrative, which makes the new one feel not just unproven, but actively implausible. The men who successfully made this decision almost always described making it during a moment of unusual internal quiet. Not necessarily a dramatic moment, often something almost mundane. Early in the morning, before the day had assembled its full weight. During a walk, in the specific quality of stillness that arrives sometimes in the evening when everything demanding has finally gone quiet. Not because those moments are magical, because in those moments, the internal environment is temporarily less dominated by the established narrative, and the new one, usually drowned out by the noise of current circumstance, can be heard with unusual clarity. This is one of the reasons the early morning practice we discussed in earlier videos matters so much. Not just for the specific work of mental rehearsal, but for the quality of internal environment it creates. The specific stillness in which decisions of this magnitude become possible in a way they rarely are during the full noise of the day. If you've stayed with me until this point in the video, it's because you're committed to creating a life of abundance and success. That's why I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Every video here is designed to help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every single day. Hill found something about the period immediately following the decision of total commitment that almost nobody anticipates correctly. Most people, when they imagine what it would feel like to finally make that decision, to genuinely commit to the new narrative over the accumulated weight of the old one, imagine it feeling like relief. Like the specific release of tension that comes from ending a long period of internal conflict. Like something finally settling into place after years of uncomfortable suspension between two competing versions of what was true about their life. That's not what Hill documented. What he found instead was something considerably less comfortable and considerably more useful to understand in advance. The period immediately following genuine commitment was, in almost every case he documented, one of the most internally turbulent periods in the entire transformation process. Not because the decision was wrong, not because the new narrative was revealing itself to be as unfounded as the old narrative had always insisted it was, but because of something specific that happens in the mind once the decision has actually been made and the new narrative has been genuinely elevated to a position of authority. The old narrative fights back with everything it has. Hill described it as the established order making its final case. Everything that had been quietly running below the surface. Every accumulated piece of evidence for the old story. Every emotionally charged memory of limitation and failure, and the specific ways reality had previously refused to cooperate with your ambitions. All of it seemed to intensify and surface simultaneously, as if the deeper mind was conducting a final audit of the evidence before accepting that the old directives were actually being replaced. This is disorienting in a way that's difficult to prepare for fully, because it arrives at the exact moment you might expect things to start feeling better, the moment after you finally made the decision you'd been building toward, the moment when some part of you expected the internal conflict to quiet down. Instead, it gets louder. Hill found that the men who understood this in advance, who had been told, explicitly, that the intensification following commitment was a predictable part of the process rather than evidence that something had gone wrong, navigated this period with dramatically more success than the men who encountered it without context. Because the interpretation you bring to this turbulence determines almost everything about whether you move through it or retreat from it. Without context, the intensification feels like revelation. The old narrative, suddenly louder and more emotionally vivid than it has been in months, seems to be exposing the new commitment as the delusion it always actually was. Every piece of evidence it presents feels newly urgent, newly relevant, newly damning in a way it didn't quite feel before the commitment was made. With context, the same intensification feels like confirmation. Confirmation that the decision registered deeply enough to actually threaten the established structure. Confirmation that something real is happening beneath the surface. Confirmation that the commitment wasn't just a surface-level intention that the deeper mind could safely ignore, but something that landed with enough force to require an actual defensive response. The turbulence is the deeper mind taking the commitment seriously. Hill watched this understanding transform the experience of this period for the men who had it versus the men who didn't. Not by making the turbulence disappear, but by changing what it meant, and in changing what it meant, changing what it produced. The men without context retreated, reinterpreted the intensification as evidence they'd been wrong, quietly released the commitment they'd just made, and returned to the familiar territory of the old narrative, which immediately became quieter and more comfortable once the thread of the new one had been withdrawn. The men with context stayed, not comfortably, not without significant internal difficulty. But they stayed, because they understood that the difficulty was the process working rather than the process failing. And what came after the staying was something Hill found remarkable enough to document with unusual care. A specific kind of quiet that arrived once the established structure had exhausted its final case. Not the quiet of defeat, not the quiet of resignation. The specific quiet of something that has been contested long enough, consistently enough, that it has finally been accepted, not warmly, not without residue of the old pattern, but accepted in the functional sense that matters most. The new narrative, having been held through the turbulence rather than released by it, settled into a position of authority that the old one could no longer effectively contest. And from that settled position, something Hill found in every case he documented began to happen in the external world. Not immediately, not dramatically at first, but with a consistency and a momentum that, once it began, felt qualitatively different from anything that had been produced by surface-level effort alone. Hill was careful here, in a way worth paying attention to, because this is the part of the story where it becomes easiest to overstate what's happening, to reach for explanations that sound impressive but don't actually describe the mechanism accurately, and in doing so, to undermine the credibility of something that is, on its own terms, genuinely remarkable without any embellishment. What Hill documented wasn't magic. It wasn't the universe rearranging itself in response to someone's internal state, in the way that phrase is sometimes used to describe something essentially passive, as if changing your thinking is sufficient, by itself, to produce external results without any corresponding change in behavior or action. What he documented was considerably more interesting than magic, and considerably more grounded in the actual mechanics of how human behavior and human perception operate in the real world. Here's what actually happens when the new narrative finally settles into a position of genuine internal authority. The first thing that changes isn't circumstances, it's perception. Specifically, what becomes visible. The external world doesn't change in the immediate aftermath of internal commitment. The same opportunities that existed before the commitment still exist. The same relationships, the same environment, the same practical landscape of what's available to someone in your specific situation. What changes is which parts of that landscape your attention actually lands on. Hill had documented the mechanism behind this earlier in his research, the way the deeper mind acts as a filter for conscious attention, determining what gets elevated to awareness and what gets processed below the threshold of conscious notice. Once the new narrative becomes the authoritative one at the level of the deeper mind, that filter gets recalibrated. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, across days and weeks, the things your attention naturally lands on in any given environment start to shift. Conversations that would previously have passed through your awareness as irrelevant background noise start resolving into something worth listening to. Connections you've had for years suddenly appear in a different light, not because those people have changed, but because your filter is now set to notice dimensions of them that were previously invisible to you. Opportunities that were always present in your environment, always there, always technically available, start registering as actual possibilities rather than things that obviously apply to other kinds of people. Hill called this the awakening of new sight, not literal vision. The specific quality of attention that a mind operating from a different internal narrative brings to the same external world that a mind operating from the old narrative was moving through without seeing. And here's what this shift in perception produces, practically and mechanically, that eventually shows up as changed external circumstances. Different decisions. Not dramatic, visible, obviously strategic decisions. Small ones. The kind that occur dozens of times a day, below the threshold of conscious deliberation, in the space between noticing something and responding to it. A conversation that would previously have been deflected gets engaged with directly. An opportunity that would previously have been dismissed in the first few seconds gets considered long enough to actually evaluate. A connection that would previously have been treated as a casual acquaintance gets followed up with in a way that eventually produces something concrete. None of these individual decisions feel like turning points while they're happening. That's exactly the point, and exactly why this process is so consistently underestimated by people who are looking for something more dramatic. But they compound. Each slightly different decision, made from a slightly different internal position, produces a slightly different outcome than the old decision would have produced. And those slightly different outcomes, accumulated across enough time, produce a trajectory that diverges increasingly from the one the old narrative was generating. Hill documented this compounding effect with unusual precision because he found it explained something that puzzled people observing these transformations from the outside. Why the change, when it finally became visible in someone's external circumstances, seemed to arrive almost suddenly, after a long period during which nothing appeared to be happening. It didn't arrive suddenly. It had been compounding quietly, in hundreds of small decisions and small perceptual shifts, for months before it became large enough to be visible from the outside. The sudden appearance was an artifact of the observation threshold, the point at which the accumulated change finally exceeded what could be attributed to normal variation and became undeniably, visibly different from the trajectory that had preceded it. But the change itself had been happening continuously, from the moment the new narrative settled into authority and started producing different automatic behavior. This brings up a question Hill considered among the most practically important in his entire body of research, something about how to actually sustain this process across the long period between internal commitment and external confirmation, without losing the new narrative's authority to the inevitable friction of a world that hasn't yet caught up to the internal change. Hill found that the period between internal commitment and external confirmation was, paradoxically, the most dangerous period in the entire transformation process. Not the period before the decision, not the turbulence immediately following it. The long, quiet middle stretch, weeks or months where the internal change had genuinely happened, where the new narrative had genuinely settled into authority, but where the external world was still largely reflecting the old story. This period was dangerous for a specific reason Hill identified with unusual clarity. The external world, during this stretch, is providing constant, detailed, emotionally charged feedback that contradicts the new narrative at every turn. The bank account still reflects the old reality. The relationships still respond to the old version of you, because the people around you haven't yet had enough experience of the new version to update their perception of who you are. The practical circumstances of daily life still carry the specific texture of the old story, the same constraints, the same limitations, the same familiar evidence that the new narrative is, despite the internal commitment made to it, still more aspiration than fact. And the mind, encountering this constant external feedback, faces a specific daily pressure. The pressure to update the internal narrative to match the external evidence. This is what minds are designed to do. Continuously reconciling internal model with external feedback, updating beliefs to match observed reality, maintaining consistency between what's stored inside and what's being reported from outside. In most contexts, this is exactly what you want your mind doing. Accurate calibration with reality is generally useful. But during this specific period, when the internal change is genuine and the external world simply hasn't caught up yet, this calibration mechanism works against the very transformation it's trying to accurately report on. Every time the external world sends feedback that contradicts the new narrative, and during this period, it sends that feedback constantly, the mind experiences pressure to revise the new narrative back towards something more consistent with what's currently observable. Hill found that most people yielded to this pressure gradually, without ever making a conscious decision to abandon the new narrative. It happened through small, almost imperceptible revisions. A slight qualification added to the new narrative. A small hedge. A minor retreat from the full authority of the new story towards something a little more consistent with current external evidence. Each individual revision was small enough to feel like reasonable updating rather than retreat. But accumulated across enough of these small revisions, the new narrative gradually lost its authority, not through a single decision to quit, but through the slow erosion of 1,000 small accommodations to a world that wasn't yet reflecting the internal change. Hill considered this the most common reason transformations failed, not the turbulence at the beginning, not the difficulty of the practice, but this quiet erosion in the middle, mistaken for realism rather than recognized for what it actually was. Premature updating. Revising the internal narrative based on external feedback that was real, but that was reporting on the old trajectory rather than the new one. Feedback generated by decisions made before the commitment, now being treated as evidence about the validity of the commitment itself. The men who successfully sustained the new narrative through this period had developed something specific Hill found difficult to name precisely, but returned to in multiple interviews across his research. A kind of temporal patience with the external world, an understanding, held practically rather than just philosophically, that the external world reports on the past. That what's currently visible in your circumstances is the result of decisions and internal states that existed weeks or months ago, not evidence about whether the current internal state is valid or productive. This understanding allowed them to encounter contradicting external feedback without treating it as authoritative information about the new narrative's validity. They could see the old results appearing in the external world and understand, clearly and without denial, that those results were accurate reports about who they used to be, not accurate predictions about who they were becoming. This temporal reframe sounds simple. The practice of maintaining it, daily, against the constant pressure of a world that is genuinely, accurately reporting on your past rather than your present, is one of the most demanding things Hill documented in his research. But the men who maintained it long enough for the external world to actually start catching up described something that made the difficulty retroactively comprehensible. The moment when the external feedback finally started shifting, when the first results appeared that clearly couldn't be attributed to the old trajectory, that were unmistakably the product of the new internal state rather than the old one. That moment produced a quality of confirmation unlike anything else in the process. Not just satisfaction at external results, something deeper than that. A specific, felt validation of the entire framework, of the understanding that the internal precedes the external, that the commitment made in the absence of evidence was the correct move, that the temporal patience had been warranted. And that validation, once genuinely experienced rather than simply understood intellectually, changed something permanently about how these men related to the gap between internal commitment and external confirmation. They stopped experiencing it as waiting. They started experiencing it as the natural lag between cause and effect, as predictable and as unremarkable as the gap between planting a seed and harvesting what it produces. Up until this point in the video, we've been talking primarily about the internal architecture of what needs to happen, the decision, the commitment, the navigation of resistance and turbulence, and the long middle stretch of external contradiction. All of that is essential context. Without it, the tools Hill documented are just techniques, things you can apply mechanically without understanding why they work, which almost always produces results that are temporary at best and disappointing at worst. But with that context in place, the specific tools Hill identified become something different. Not techniques to be executed, but mechanisms to be understood. Each one making complete sense in light of everything we've already covered about how the deeper mind actually receives instruction and what it actually responds to. Hill identified 3 primary tools, used in combination, that he found consistently produced genuine subconscious reprogramming in the men he studied. Not 1 or 2 of them. All 3, working together, each one addressing a different aspect of the communication problem between the conscious and subconscious levels of mind. The first was what Hill called autosuggestion, not in the popular, simplified sense that word has taken on since Hill used it. The idea of repeating positive phrases until they somehow become true. Something far more specific and far more demanding than that. Hill's autosuggestion was the deliberate, daily, emotionally charged repetition of a specific statement of desired reality, not as a wish, not as an aspiration, but as a present tense declaration of something already in the process of becoming real. Delivered to yourself, in the specific quality of internal quiet we discussed earlier, with enough genuine emotional engagement that the statement carried actual feeling rather than hollow words. The emotional charge was everything. Hill was explicit about this in a way most retellings of his work fail to preserve. He didn't just say repeat affirmations. He said repeat them with feelings so genuine that the deeper mind receives them as emotionally real experience rather than neutral verbal information. The statement itself had to be specific, not "I am wealthy" in the vague, general sense that produces the kind of hollow repetition the deeper mind simply filters out. A specific amount, a specific date, a specific value being provided in exchange. Something concrete enough that the deeper mind could form a genuine image around it rather than processing it as empty abstraction. And it had to be delivered in the specific conditions of internal quiet. Ideally in the early morning window, when the gatekeeper's filtering capacity was at its lowest and the deeper mind was most permeable to new input. Hill found that autosuggestion, practiced correctly, was doing something that willpower and strategic thinking simply couldn't do. It was introducing specific, emotionally charged, repeatedly confirmed information to the level of mind where actual belief is stored, gradually, through accumulated repetition, building a new belief structure from the inside rather than trying to change behavior from the outside. The second tool was what Hill called the definite chief aim. A written, specific, detailed statement of the exact outcome being worked toward. Not a general direction, but a precise destination. The exact amount of wealth desired. The exact date by which it would be achieved. The exact value being offered in exchange for it. Because Hill found that the deeper mind responded very differently to desires framed as exchanges rather than simply as wants. The act of writing this statement was itself part of the mechanism. Hill found that the physical act of writing, of translating internal desire into specific external language that could be read back, produced a different quality of encoding than purely mental formulation. Something about the deliberateness required to put it into words, to commit it to a form that could be returned to and re-experienced, engaged the deeper mind differently than simply thinking about what you wanted. The written statement was then read aloud, daily, with the same emotional engagement required for autosuggestion, not as recitation but as genuine re-experiencing of the felt reality of the stated outcome. The third tool was what Hill called the mastermind. The deliberate cultivation of at least one relationship with another person whose belief in your desired outcome was as real and as strong as your own. Not general encouragement. Someone who actually understood what you were building and held genuine conviction about its viability. Hill found that this relationship served a specific function during the long middle stretch between commitment and external confirmation. It provided an external source of belief during the periods when the internal supply was running low, when the constant pressure of contradicting external feedback had temporarily eroded the new narrative's authority and the ability to sustain it from purely internal resources was stretched thin. A single conversation with someone who held genuine conviction about your direction during one of these periods could restore the internal narrative's authority more quickly than days of solo practice. Not because the other person's belief was more valid than your own, but because belief, experienced socially rather than in isolation, carries a different quality of felt reality that the deeper mind responds to with unusual force. These three tools, used together and understood in the context of everything we've covered, formed the complete system Hill documented for making the mind obey, not through force or willpower, but through the specific, consistent, emotionally engaged communication that the deeper mind was actually designed to receive. But there's one final element Hill considered more important than all three of these tools combined, something that determined whether they worked or simply produced the appearance of working without the substance. Hill arrived at this understanding late in his research, and he wrote about it with a directness that's worth paying attention to, because it corrects a misunderstanding that derails an enormous number of people who encounter his work and try to apply it. The tools work. Autosuggestion, the definite chief aim, the mastermind. Hill had documented their effectiveness across enough cases and enough years to be certain of that. Used correctly, with genuine emotional engagement and genuine consistency, they produce real changes in the deeper mind that eventually produce real changes in external circumstances. But Hill found something that determined whether the tools were being used correctly in the first place. Something prior to technique. Something that, when absent, caused every tool to produce only the appearance of the practice rather than the substance of it. Hollow repetition that looked from the outside like genuine application, but that the deeper mind, with its complete indifference to performance, simply filtered out as irrelevant noise. He called it sincerity of desire. And I want to be careful about how I describe this, because it's easy to hear that phrase and assume it's simply saying that you have to want the thing badly enough, that the tools fail when desire is insufficient and succeed when desire is strong enough. That's not what Hill meant, and it's not what he found. What he meant by sincerity of desire was something more specific and considerably more uncomfortable for most people to honestly examine. He meant that the outcome being worked toward had to be something you actually wanted, not something you thought you should want, not something you'd been told was the right thing to want, not something that looked like the appropriate goal for someone at your stage of life or in your particular circumstances. Something you genuinely, personally, specifically wanted. This distinction matters enormously because of something Hill observed consistently across his research. People apply these tools with genuine effort and genuine consistency toward outcomes that aren't actually their own desires. Outcomes they've absorbed from family expectation, social pressure, the specific version of success most visible and most celebrated in their immediate environment. And the deeper mind, which doesn't respond to what you think you should want, but only to what you actually feel, registers the absence of genuine desire immediately. The emotional charge the tools require in order to work, the specific quality of felt reality that carries information past the filtering threshold into the level where actual belief is stored, simply isn't present when the desire isn't genuine. You can repeat the statement. You can write the aim. You can construct the relationship. But if the desire underneath all of it is borrowed rather than genuinely your own, the emotional charge required to make any of it work will always be just slightly out of reach. Always feeling slightly manufactured. Always producing the hollow quality of going through the motions rather than the genuine internal engagement the tools are designed to generate. Hill found this explained something that puzzled him early in his research. Why did the same tools, applied with apparently similar effort and apparently similar consistency, produce dramatically different results in different people? The effort and the consistency were sometimes genuinely similar. What differed was the authenticity of the desire underneath them. The man whose stated goal was genuinely his own, who had arrived at it through honest examination of what he actually wanted rather than through absorption of what the people around him expected, brought a quality of felt reality to the practice that no amount of technique could replicate in someone working towards someone else's version of success. This is worth sitting with honestly, because it raises a question most people working toward financial goals have never actually examined with genuine care. Is what you're working toward actually what you want? Not what makes sense for someone in your situation. Not what the people around you recognize as legitimate success. Not the version of wealth or freedom or achievement that looks most reasonable or most impressive from the outside. What do you actually want? When you're completely honest with yourself and the specific quality of quiet where genuine honesty becomes possible. Hill found that many people, when they actually examined this question with real care for the first time, discovered something uncomfortable. The goal they had been working toward, sometimes for years, with genuine effort and genuine sacrifice, wasn't fully their own. It was assembled from pieces of other people's expectations, socially validated definitions of success, and the specific limitations of what seemed achievable rather than what was actually desired. And the tools applied toward that assembled goal produced at best partial results, because the emotional charge required to make them fully work was always slightly insufficient, undermined by some deep, quiet part of the self that knew the goal wasn't really its own. The correction Hill identified wasn't to abandon the tools. It was to apply them toward something genuine first. To do the harder, quieter, less structured work of identifying what you actually want, with enough specificity and enough honest self-examination that the desire you eventually bring to the practice is real enough to carry the emotional charge the deeper mind actually responds to. Because a genuinely desired outcome, even a modest one, practiced with authentic emotional engagement, will produce more real change in the deeper mind than a spectacular goal practiced with borrowed desire and hollow technique. The tools are precise instruments. They work exactly as well as the authenticity of the desire they're pointed at. And there's one final thing Hill found about what happens when all of this finally comes together. When genuine desire meets consistent practice, meets the specific conditions we've spent this entire video building toward. Something about the quality of life that emerges from a mind that has finally, genuinely learned to obey. Hill expected, before he had documented enough cases to know better, that the experience of a mind that had genuinely been brought into obedience would feel primarily like power, like control, like the specific satisfaction of finally being the one directing the show rather than watching your own behavior from a slight distance, noticing patterns you didn't choose, producing outcomes you didn't want, feeling like a passenger in a life that should have been responding to your actual intentions. That's not what the men he interviewed described. What they described was something quieter than power, and in some ways more valuable. They described feeling, for what many of them said was the first time in their adult lives, genuinely at home in their own minds. Not the absence of difficulty, not the end of uncertainty or challenge, or the full range of experiences that constitute an actual life rather than a protected fantasy of one. All of those things remained. The men Hill interviewed who had achieved genuine internal mastery weren't living in some frictionless paradise of perpetual ease. They were living in the same complicated, uncertain, demanding world everyone else was navigating. The difference was in the quality of their relationship with their own internal experience of that world. Before the transformation, the mind had been an unreliable environment, something that produced fear without obvious cause. Something that generated resistance precisely when forward movement was most needed. Something that, left to its own default patterns, consistently produced internal states that worked against the external outcomes being consciously desired. After the transformation, after genuine, sustained, emotionally engaged practice had actually succeeded in replacing the old operating instructions with new ones, the mind became something different. Not a tool exactly. Hill resisted that framing because it implied a separation between the person and the mind that didn't accurately describe what genuine mastery actually felt like from the inside. Something more like an ally, a part of the self that was finally, consistently, working in the same direction as the conscious intention rather than in quiet opposition to it. Not perfectly, not without occasional reversion to older patterns, particularly under unusual stress or in genuinely novel circumstances that temporarily activated old responses, but consistently enough that the experience of daily life changed in quality, not just in external results. Decisions that had previously required enormous conscious effort. Overriding fear, resisting the pull of familiar but limiting patterns, choosing the response aligned with the new narrative rather than the one the old programming was generating, started happening with less effort. Not effortlessly, but with less friction, as if the path that had once required constant deliberate force was gradually becoming smoother, not because it had changed, but because the part of the mind that used to resist it had stopped resisting quite so hard. Hill found something specific about this experience worth documenting, because it revealed something important about what the entire practice was actually building toward that the language of making your mind obey doesn't fully capture. The men who had achieved genuine internal mastery didn't describe it as winning a war against their own deeper mind. They described it as arriving at a peace they hadn't known was possible. A peace that came not from the mind finally doing what it was told, in the way a reluctant employee might comply with instructions they resented, but from the conscious and subconscious levels of mind finally wanting the same things, finally operating from the same narrative, finally moving in the same direction with the full weight of both levels of the mind behind the movement. That alignment, conscious intention and subconscious programming finally pointing the same direction, produced something in the external world that was, by any measurable standard, more than either could have produced operating in opposition. And it produced something in the internal experience of daily life that Hill found even more worth documenting than the external results. A quality of presence in each moment that distracted, conflicted, internally divided people simply don't have access to. Because when the mind isn't consuming enormous resources managing the conflict between what you consciously want and what your programming is automatically producing, those resources become available for something else. For genuine attention to what's actually in front of you. For the quality of engagement with people and situations and opportunities that makes you someone others want to be around, want to work with, want to bring their best ideas to. For the specific kind of creative thinking that only becomes possible when the mind isn't spending most of its capacity fighting itself. Hill found that this quality of presence, this specific, palpable sense of someone whose internal resources weren't consumed by internal conflict, was itself one of the most practically powerful things the transformation produced. More powerful, in some documented cases, than any specific strategy or skill or knowledge the men had acquired. Because people respond to presence in ways that are difficult to quantify, but impossible to miss. And a mind that has finally, genuinely learned to work with itself rather than against itself carries a quality of presence that opens doors no technique can open and builds trust no performance can manufacture. Let's go back to where we started. Your mind has been running your life without your permission for decades. That's where we began. And I want to return to it now, not to repeat it, but to show you how completely different that sentence sounds after everything we've covered together. Because when you first heard it, it probably landed as accusation, as diagnosis, as the identification of a problem, something broken, something working against you, something that needed to be defeated or controlled or forced into submission before your actual life could begin. That's not what Hill found. What Hill found, across 20 years and 500 interviews and the documented stories of men who built extraordinary lives from genuinely ordinary beginnings, was something that only makes complete sense once you've understood the full architecture of what we've been discussing. The mind that has been running your life without your permission wasn't broken. It was doing exactly what minds are designed to do, executing the instructions it received with complete precision and complete consistency, regardless of whether those instructions were ones the current version of you would consciously choose. It was loyal to a version of you that no longer exists, to beliefs installed by experiences that no longer accurately describe your actual capability, to a story about what's possible for someone like you that was written by circumstances you had no hand in choosing, at a time when you had no defenses against what was being written. That loyalty was never your enemy. It was simply misdirected. And the entire practice we've spent this video exploring. The emotional language of the deeper mind, the decision of total commitment, the navigation of resistance and turbulence, and the long middle stretch. The three tools used in combination. The sincerity of desire that makes everything else actually work. None of it was about defeating the subconscious mind. It was about giving it new instructions. Real ones. Yours. Chosen deliberately. Held with genuine emotional engagement. Delivered through the specific conditions that allow the deeper mind to receive them as authoritative rather than filtering them out as irrelevant noise. Because the mind that has been running your life without your permission isn't running it without permission because it wants to. It's running it that way because nobody ever taught it to do anything different. Nobody showed it who you actually are, rather than who your early circumstances suggested you were. Nobody delivered instructions with enough emotional clarity and enough consistent repetition that the deeper mind could recognize them as genuine directives rather than passing wishes. Nobody gave it something new to be loyal to. Until now. This is what Hill meant, ultimately, by making your mind obey. Not domination. Not the suppression of one part of yourself by another. The specific, patient, emotionally honest practice of bringing the full depth of your own mind into alignment with the life you're actually capable of living. A life that was never actually unavailable to you. That was always waiting, with complete patience, without judgment, without any deadline on when you were allowed to begin, for the moment you understood clearly enough what was actually required to reach it. The moment you stopped trying to change your circumstances through surface-level effort alone and started doing the deeper work of changing the mind that generates those circumstances from the inside. Hill spent 20 years documenting why some people make it and others don't. And what he found, every single time, at the bottom of every story of genuine transformation, was always the same thing. Not better luck. Not better timing. Not some special quality of character that certain people are born with and others simply aren't. A mind that had finally been given instructions it could actually work with. A mind that had finally been shown, through consistent, emotionally genuine, patient practice, who the person it was running actually was. Not who their circumstances had suggested they were. Who they actually were. The mind follows the instructions it receives. It always has. The only question that was ever worth asking was what instructions you were actually giving it. And whether, starting from this specific moment, you're finally ready to give it something worth following. If this video gave you something real, follow the channel and share it with 5 people whose minds are ready for new instructions. Every video here exists for one reason: to help you become the person your own deeper mind was always capable of building once it finally understood who you actually are.